So tonight I'd like to focus on what we're trying to get away from, which you should have ample experience of, but maybe have never named it so clearly. And I'm using several authors, contemporary authors who speak about our plight. It goes all the way back, as one of them points out, actually several of them point out, to the Buddha's mentioning that life is essentially unsatisfactory, inadequate, that nothing satisfies. Dukkha, as he called it. It's a kind of suffering. And what that consists in is not so much the transitoriness of life, which is what it is. This shouldn't be a problem. But it's our reaction to it and our own mental monkeying around, mental leaping around, and our anxieties and our fears and all the stuff in our feelings that get in the way and that cause the trouble, as Buddha pointed out, calling it clinging to what we have lest we lose it, anxious about what we don't have lest we get it, etc. So one of the contemporary books that just came out that speaks about this is Sam Harris. He's the famous skeptic, famous atheist. It's called Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion. You hear a lot about that. Father Xavier has already asked me informally, at least, to be on a panel to discuss this book sometime. We'll see if that happens. But it is a fascinating book. It's not for the faint-hearted, all right? He's a virulent atheist, so he has nothing good to say about religion. So it's not for the faint-hearted, nor is Zen, nor is life. But he does do a great service, I think, by pointing out that this is an experience both of the problem and of the solution that's open to anybody. You don't have to believe anything, you just have to practice it. But you don't even have to believe Buddhists, you just have to do it. So he does have some description here. He says it is always now, which is what Zen is always trying to point out, not to mention the power of now, which I'm going to come to in a second. It sounds trite, but it's the truth. He says we spend most of our lives forgetting this truth, that it's now is our life. As he says, overlooking it, fleeing it, repudiating it, and the horror is that we succeed. We manage to avoid being happy while struggling to become the future, or regretting the past. Fulfilling one desire after the next, banishing our fears, grasping at pleasure, recoiling from pain, and thinking interminably about how best to keep the whole works up and running. Sound familiar? As a consequence, we spend our lives being far less content than we might otherwise be. We fail to appreciate what we have until we've lost it. We crave experiences, objects, relationships, only to grow bored with them. And yet the craving persists, as the Buddha speaks about craving. I speak from experience, of course. So, but he points out that we can, do mindfulness meditation, do all sorts of, he followed the mindfulness school in particular, as he said. We can begin to be free from this. He says, actually speaking about psychedelic experiences, that's a whole chapter. People like Ramadas and others have tried this. But he says the experience, however induced, of the oneness, of being connected, of being ego-less, it reveals how wondrously at ease in the universe a human being can be. And for most of us, normal waking consciousness, he says, does not offer so much as a glimmer of those deeper possibilities. People generally come away from such experiences with a sense that conventional states of consciousness obscure and truncate sacred insights and emotions. Amen to that. Reveals how utterly transfigured a mind can be by a full collision with the present moment. Exactly. If you really have a full collision that breaks open your mind and your heart, that's a big explosion. How utterly transfigured a mind can be by a full collision with the present moment. And he very much said he's he has experienced, for example, what he calls the essential selflessness of consciousness. When you're truly conscious, when you truly wake up, this is what, in fact, all the mystics say of all traditions, you discover pure selflessness. That consciousness is pure consciousness, Buddha mind, Christ consciousness, is essentially selfless. Not in the sense of being generous, but there's no self. He confirms what the Buddhists have always been teaching, and the West hasn't really said very clearly, that the illusion of being a self that has all these experiences and these thoughts is an illusion. When you really look at it, and you dissect and deconstruct your thoughts and your feelings, there's nobody behind it. Certainly not your little ego self that thinks, these are my thoughts, and these are my feelings, and my fears, and my plans, and my history. It's nothing there. That's what Zen and meditation practice like Vipassana is. That's what it will show you. Whereas, if you're really present right here and now, and really wake up to the full dimensions of consciousness, you discover, wow, vast, boundless, as the Buddha said, pure consciousness, not self-consciousness, pure consciousness is what is possible. And he even goes so far as to say in one of the early chapters, based on his own experience, not on what somebody's read, said, or said, he says it's boundless love. It's open to your experience. This pure consciousness is boundless love. Not dependent on the characteristics of anything or anybody, but just overflowing love. Now, he refuses to make any objective statements about this. He's just saying this is a subjective experience. Okay, he's kind of a mystical Kantian, whereas he has Hume, David Hume's soul, just the mind. But Eckhart Tolle, for example, on the other hand, says in the introduction to his book, The Power of Now, how many of you have read The Power of Now? I hope most people, if you haven't read it. It's just pure Zen, pure reality, which is what Zen is supposed to be anyway. He says, he says you don't have to give up any of your religious, any of your religions, he says. What this book does and what practice does, any real authentic practice, it does is try to get at the root and the primal insight of all the traditions. He says religion, and this is something Sam Harris would agree with, religions have become so encumbered with all sorts of stuff, dogmas, rules, and all this stuff, that we've lost sight, and we certainly have in the West, particularly, lost sight of what it really is all about. And this is what it's really all about. To put it in kind of modern Western terms, about the transformation of consciousness, or the rediscovery of true consciousness, if you will, working through the sludge of all the nonsense that's going on in our minds and hearts at the time, which was just described, and which is, he describes also, Eckhart Tolle, many times. He says, what is the greatest obstacle to experiencing this reality that we're talking about? That's a question the book, someone poses in the book. And he says, identification with your mind. We identify with our thoughts as if our thoughts were ourselves. There's no distance from them. There's no silent observer or witness, as Ken Wilber calls it. You don't have any distance from it. It's this pure consciousness which is behind it, the root behind it all, or beyond it all, is not perceived. It's not awakened. And you know this from your own experience, and you don't want to make judgment, but to see most people speak or emote, you can tell that they're totally identified with what they're thinking or speaking or feeling. But there's no distance from it at all. At least that's where we start. And it's true, you really can't judge other people, but it does seem that way. Not to be able to stop thinking, he says, is a dreadful affliction. But we don't realize this because almost everybody is suffering from it, so it's considered normal. Both he and Harris point out, how people talk to themselves, how we talk to themselves, and they say if they did it out loud in public, people would say they're crazy. But they both point out that everybody's doing it quietly in themselves the whole time, and then we call it crazy. It is. It's a disease, as he says on the next page. This is a disease. Yet we consider it normal. This inner chatter, this monkey mind, as the Buddhists call it, we think it's the way things are. Well, it is the way things are, but not the way they really are. If we wake up to what's really there, not what's the illusion and the smoke and mirrors of our constant chatter. Thinking has become a disease, he says, out of balance. He says the mind is a superb instrument if used rightly. Used wrongly, however, it's very destructive. To put it more accurately, it is not so much that you use your mind wrongly. You usually don't use it at all. It uses you. We're possessed. When the Bible, and Richard Royce pointed this out, when the Bible speaks about, the New Testament speaks about people being possessed, this is what they're possessed by. This monkey in their heads. They're possessed, literally possessed. They have no power over it. It's controlling you. And even more, your emotions, the fears and the angers and all the stuff that you're constantly rehearsing and remembering or fearing, the future or the past, and we're so identified with, that's even worse possession. And it really is, as some other writers, my yoga teacher, for example, have said, that they're really forces in you. It's energy that's literally possessing you, or obsessing you, obsessive compulsive. It's really there. Those are real demons. Those are the real demons, not some entity coming out from heaven or hell. It's us from our own hell in here. We need to be delivered, exercised by practice, waking up to the Spirit, Christ, the real consciousness. That's really there, or whatever name you want to give it. You believe that you are your mind, and this is the delusion. The instrument is taken over. And then he speaks about our fears, and our emotions the same way. The fears is so much a part of our inner consciousness. Fear of the future, fear of the past, fear of self, fear of others. And he says if you identify with a mental position, then if you're wrong, your mind-based sense of self is threatened with annihilation. So this is what causes wars, because we're so identified with our way of thinking and our way of understanding, and we fear that something will threaten it, and that's us. And if we don't have that, then we're annihilated, which is sheer illusion. He says it needs to be defended and fed constantly. The most common ego identifications have to do with possessions, the work you do, social status and recognition, knowledge and education, physical appearance, special abilities, relationships, personal and family history, belief systems, a biggie, belief systems, political, nationalistic, racial, religious, and other collective identifications. None of these is you. None of them. Well, then who am I? Well, that's the whole question. He says, do you find this frightening? Or do you find it liberating? Is it a relief? It is a relief. Once you begin to experience there is, after all, something better than that. It's not nothing, or it is no thing. That's the whole point. It's a little scary at first because it's no thing. None of those things and no thing at all. But then he goes on to say, well, so is God. God is no thing either. God is nothing. Which is not what atheists say. It's what the Kabbalah says, for example, or some Christian mystics. God is nothing. God is no thing. All of these things you will have to relinquish sooner or later. Anyway, when you die. Hopefully before that. So you should die before you die. That's what he says at the very end here, something Richard Rohr often repeats. The secret of life, he says, is to die before you die and find that there is no death. But that's the condition. It's passion and resurrection, if you like. The secret of life is to die before you die to all this false self, and find that there is no death. Because when you do die to all those things, you found, wow, something that can't die. That's who I really am. Well, to use Sam Harris's boundless love. It's who you are. It's who you are. Christ consciousness. It's yours. We have the mind of Christ, as St. Paul said. He says, well, you have to relinquish it sooner or later, at least when death comes. So don't wait that long. Die before you die, and then it won't be a terror, because death itself is an illusion. You can't die. That part of you, that really, you're real, you can't die. Which is exactly what Jesus says to Martha before raising Lazarus. He says, whoever lives believing in me, having this consciousness, can never die. Can't die. I mean, the body dies, all these other things, these other identities, superficial identities die, but not really you. You got to discover that. And I'll close by using a description by Richard Rohr, whom I've already mentioned. He says a number of these things, often in his teaching, in Franciscan house. This came on one of his emails recently, and it's just a very good description of, again, where we start, where we are, with some other elements included. It says contemplation, or what we would say practice, contemplative practice, is the key to unlocking the attachments and addictions. And addictions are the reactions, false self, the reaction to all these fears and cravings, etc., of the mind. Addictions for attachments and addictions, so we can see clearly. Some form of contemplative practice, what we're doing here, is necessary to be able to detach from your own agenda, your own anger, your own ego, and your own fear. And that's important. I totally support that statement. If there's not some kind of contemplative practice in your life, you will not only will you not be able to escape these things, you won't even notice that it's a disease. You'll think it's, as we just heard, you'll think it's normal. No wonder there's so much depression, suicide. If this is really me, it's a hell. But the whole wonderful thing is, it's not you. You gotta wake up from your dream yourself. Okay, I find most people operate not out of consciousness, but out of their level of practiced brain function, which relies on, listen to this, early life conditioning, has little to do with God encounter, or grace, or mercy, or freedom, or love. It's boundless love that we're talking about. We primarily operate from habituated patterns based on what mom told me, what went wrong when I was young, and the defense mechanisms I learned that help me to be right and good, be first, or famous, or whatever I may want to be. It's not all bad, but they're not all good either. As you may know, Eckhart Tolle speaks a lot about the pain body. That's the possession with all these, the pain that we've identified with from our past, early childhood, whatever it might be. And we're imprisoned by it, we're possessed by it, and it feeds on itself. How many people, and he goes on to say that, all of that old and practiced thinking has to be recognized and accounted for, which is the work of contemplation. Without contemplation, you don't see clearly. Everything is all about you. You just keep seeing everything through your own agenda, your own anger, and your own wounds. That's Woody Allen type of therapy. Just constantly going over, regurgitating all your own stuff. Isn't that most people you know? Think about it. People just keep talking about their own agenda, their own anger, and their own wounds, and they're completely identified with it. I know lots of people like that. Do you? Starting right here. Few ever achieve much inner freedom. Amen to that. Contemplation, he says, sadly, helps you see your woundedness. That's okay. It doesn't stop there. Remember, there's something below it. You've got to see it first. That's why most people do not stay long with contemplative prayer. One period. Because it's not very glorious. It's a continual humiliation. Oh my God, this is what I've been thinking was me the whole time. And here I go again. Got to keep coming back to the breath, to the practice. He says we need some form of contemplative practice that touches our unconscious conditioning, where all our wounds lie, where all our defense mechanisms are operative secretly, but effectively. once these are not taken so seriously, there's finally room for the inrushing of God and of grace in Christian terms. So that's why we do what we do here, or in centering prayer, whatever else you do. To become aware of the false self that all this is describing. Aware that it is a false self. And then at the same time, to reach a level and through practice to realize, wow, there's something so much better and so much more there that really is you, your true self. And you will experience that. But as you say, you've got to go through the woundedness first. And few there are who achieve that, even this beginning of inner freedom. Without contemplation, I don't think it's possible. Narrow the path that leads to life, and how few there are who find it. Somebody famous said that. He wasn't talking about being a good little boy or girl. He was talking about real freedom.